Fortunately, a vast body of scientific evidence now exists on how, when, and why people say yes or vote yes. In the late 1950s, the American public was troubled by such questions after concealed ads were reportedly shown to unwitting moviegoers. The initial obsession with subliminals was short-lived, however, as the controversial practice of advertising below the threshold of awareness was neither proven effective nor widely used. But the seeds of subsequent subliminal scares were planted, and the notion that what you don't see may be as important as what you do see would rise again and again into the American consciousness. A special report explores the hysteria surrounding the subliminal messages from the 1950s to the not-so-distant future. What is a subliminal influence? The first thing we need to do is to we're talking about and why it's worth examining. So what do we mean when we say something is subliminal? The term subliminal technically means below the threshold of perception, but this definition is not actually used in the practice, because most experts in perceptual psychology and in cognitive science agree that information is truly below the limit of perception, either too soft, too distant, or too faint, is simply not perceived reliably in any way. That is, if the stimulus strength is too weak to become the focus of attention, it is also too weak to activate any unconscious process. The loophole in this concept is that we can envision classes of stimuli which are above the basic stimulus threshold for perception, but escape notice for other reasons. A more practical working definition of a subliminal influence that captures the spirit of the way the term is commonly used would be information that influences our behavior without being consciously aware of this influence. Now that is, the term is used to mean that we can unconsciously understand and act upon a message that we don't notice and we have received. This implies some particular way of determining that we have been influenced by the message. Now, the popular use of the term subliminal often implies messages that we can perceive but don't perceive. An example of this would be messages that we aren't directly attending, such as in the experimental mode of dichotic listening, where we hear different messages in each ear and try to, in theory, the message that we are not directly attending is heard subliminally. Another example would be the visible message hidden within a larger pattern. This includes such cases as the infamous claims made in the 1970s by various authors that advertisers were hiding messages in mundane pictures in order to secretly titillate the viewer and thus influence their state of mind towards the product. Most of the practices used in neurolinguistic programming and in hypnosis in general either provide messages that we are fully conscious of perceiving or provide messages that we could perceive but are not directly attending. The term subliminal can also imply a message and that we cannot consciously perceive at all, such as the experimental model of chiastic images which are seemingly flashed too rapidly to be recognized consciously. And if the claims of audio self-help subliminal tape manufacturers are accurate, then there are also audio methods of encoding messages that are not perceived, such as by modulating music patterns by the frequency and amplitude of vocal patterns. There is nothing subliminal in this sense in the classical model of hypnosis, nor in the typical neurolinguistic programming defining subliminal for experimental purposes. So, subliminal perception refers to an apparent perception that occurs according to some sort of test of sub-threshold levels or unconscious types of sensory stimuli. The sensory threshold may be experimentally defined as either in two ways. Subjectively, the intensity or stimulus type below which someone does not report the presence of the stimuli, or reports it less than half of the time, or objectively, below which they cannot detect the presence of the stimuli, or they detect it in less than half of the time. So what is the difference between reporting and detecting? In the subjective measure of threshold reporting, the subject is asked whether they are aware of a stimulus. In the objective measure of the threshold detection, the observer is asked to detect between multiple stimuli presented successively. The subjective method defines awareness as the ability to discriminate between alternatives in a forced choice test. Threshold stimuli are reported or detected less than half of the time or not at all. So that's remarkable. Recent studies indicate that subliminal perception is probably best viewed as a perception in the absence of concurrent phenomenal experience. This is opposed to the mistaken notion of perception in the absence of a detectable signal. The former is directly applicable to hypnosis, while the latter is more applicable to the questionable business of subliminal persuasion technologies. The typical test of subliminal perception involves a picture or a word flashed for a very brief period of time by means of a tachoscope. The stimuli are considered sub-threshold or subliminal because the subject generally cannot report with accuracy above the chance levels. Whether a message is being flashed or a blank screen is being shown. The efforts of subliminal perception are tested by means of having the subject perform a task that can be influenced by the sub-threshold stimulus. If this influence occurs reliably, then there is considered to be evidence that that information can be processed without conscious awareness. The two important questions about this are then, under what conditions and with what kind of information and processing this occurs, if it occurs at all. And two, how this information perceived compares with information received under other conditions, that is, does being received subliminally have any special significance? Now, in order for the subliminal influence to be interesting, it must have an effect on us that we don't find from more straightforward influences. If it were simply an information transfer that we were talking about, which we would later process consciously without knowing where it came from, it would be little interesting about it. There would be little interesting about it. It would simply be neutral information that whose source we did not remember. The theoretical position that makes subliminal influence worth considering is that messages received outside of awareness are ostensibly received and understood, but processed in the usual. Now, various forms of supposed subliminal influence are often claimed to be ways of bypassing our critical intelligence in order to reprogram our mind, without realizing what is happening. Now, several widespread fallacies have been made this idea seem more plausible than it should be, even among the knowledgeable, but it is based on a very weak foundation scientifically. This in itself, of course, does not mean that it doesn't happen, only that dramatic claims about this process should be viewed skeptically, particularly if they view or they borrow the veneer of scientific research. The type of subliminal influence we might hypothesize in hypnosis or neuro-linguistic programming is more closely related to the subtle influences of human nonverbal communication than to the idea of hidden messages that reprogram the mind. So, neuro-linguistic is words. So it's words you hear in music, on the news, wherever, that can have an effect on your thinking. That's what that's talking about. So, in a summary of contents from the book Battle for Your Mind by Dick Supkin,